This story is titled, I Never Planned to Take in Another Son, but Now I Can't Imagine Life Without Him. Life has a funny way of throwing things at you when you least expect it. You think you've got everything figured out, that you're just moving along, doing your best. And then suddenly, something shifts, and you find yourself standing at a crossroads you never imagined. That's exactly where I am right now. I have one son, Ethan, who's 12 years old. He's my world. My reason for pushing through the daily grind. Being a single dad isn't easy, but we make it work. Over the years, Ethan's built a strong friendship with Lucas, a 14-year-old boy who, if I'm being honest, has had it rough. You can just tell. Some kids carry their burdens quietly, and Lucas is one of them. I've never pried too much into his home life, but I've picked up on enough. His mom's deep into drugs, and from what I understand, he's been flagged as an at-risk kid for years. Why it's taken this long for something to be done about it, I'll never know. Last Friday, I got a call from Ethan's school. It was one of those vague, official-sounding requests, the kind that instantly makes your stomach drop. They couldn't tell me much over the phone, only that they needed my consent to share my information with a social worker regarding Lucas. I agreed, and before I knew it, I was on the phone with the social worker, who laid it all out for me. Lucas was being removed from his home immediately. No more waiting, no more warnings. Then came the kicker. The school had recommended me as a possible foster parent for Lucas. I just sat there, gripping the phone, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. They wanted me to take in Lucas, long term. Not just for a few weeks or months, but until he turned 18. Now, let me be clear. I care about the kid, more than I probably realized before that moment. I've been looking out for him in small ways for a while now. Every morning, I pick him up and take him to school along with Ethan. Some days, he spends the night at our place, especially on weekends. And whenever he's with us, I make sure he eats, because I know his school lunch is often his only real meal of the day. I even wash his clothes when I can. But there's a big difference between helping out where I can and fully taking on another child. I'm just one guy, a single dad already stretching things thin. I make a decent living, but I'm not rolling in money. Our home is small, just a 2-bedroom. Ethan and Lucas would have to share, which they don't mind now when Lucas stays over occasionally. But permanently? That's a whole other thing. Then there's the emotional weight of it. I know what it means to be responsible for another human being, and I won't pretend I'm not scared of screwing it up. The social worker was patient with me, understanding even. She told me they were struggling to place Lucas and that if I didn't take him, he'd likely be sent to a different county, new school, new environment, completely uprooted from everything familiar. I don't want that. I told them I needed time to think. With the holidays coming up, I'd already planned for Lucas to stay with us for Christmas break, so I asked if I could give them a definite answer after the new year. They agreed. Lucas doesn't know yet, and so here I am, sitting with this weight on my chest, staring at the ceiling every night, wondering what the right choice is. My heart already knows. It's screaming at me. Of course, you take him in. Of course, you give him a home, stability, a chance at something better. But my brain keeps throwing out all the reasons why it's too much, too hard, too complicated. Ethan hasn't said much about it, but I see the way he looks at me. He's watching, waiting, and maybe that's part of what makes this decision even heavier. Because this isn't just about me. It's about him too. It's about the kind of man I want to be and the kind of man I want him to grow into. And I'm running out of time to decide. The days since that phone call have passed in a strange blur, each one stretching long and heavy with the weight of the decision I have yet to make. It lingers at the edges of everything, slipping into my thoughts at the most unexpected moments, while I'm making breakfast for Ethan, while I'm driving to work, while I'm lying awake in the quiet darkness of my bedroom, listening to the soft rhythm of my son's breathing from the next room over. I keep trying to rationalize it, to break it down into something simple, something logical. I tell myself it's just a matter of logistics, that it all comes down to space, money, and time. 3 things I have only just enough of for the life I'm already living. I remind myself that I'm not some saint, that I never set out to be anyone's savior, that I'm already doing the best I can for the son I have, and that maybe, just maybe, that should be enough. But none of it sits right, because I know what will happen if I say no. I know that somewhere, in some office filled with overworked caseworkers trying to juggle a dozen emergencies at once, there is a list of available foster homes. And I know that Lucas's name will be shuffled to the bottom of it, just another file in a sea of files, just another boy who needs more than the system can give him. I know that if I say no, Lucas will be told to pack a bag to gather whatever little he can carry, and that soon he'll be climbing into the backseat of a car driven by a stranger, heading towards some new town, some new house, some new set of people who might mean well but will never be home. I know that he will sit in that car, staring out the window, silent in the way only a kid who's learned not to expect much can be, and that he won't ask where they're taking him because, deep down, he already knows it doesn't matter. And I know that no matter how much I try to push it from my mind, no matter how many times I tell myself I made the right choice, I will never truly be able to forget the look on his face when he finally finds out that I was given the chance to stop it and chose not to. I tell myself that he's not my responsibility, that I have no obligation to him beyond the kindness I've already shown. But the truth is, responsibility isn't always something you choose. Sometimes it finds you in ways you never expected, in the quiet moments when no one is watching, in the space between what is easy and what is right. And the truth is, I care about him, more than I ever let myself realize before now. Because Lucas isn't just some troubled kid from a broken home. He's the boy who sits at my kitchen table, stirring sugar into his cereal long after it's already dissolved, who rolls his eyes at Ethan's terrible jokes but always laughs anyway, who never asks for seconds, but eats every bite I put in front of him like he's memorizing the taste. He's the boy who never complains when he's cold, who never asks for anything extra, who folds his spare clothes into a neat pile at the end of the bed whenever he stays over, as if he's afraid to take up too much space, as if he's spent his whole life waiting for the moment someone tells him he's overstayed his welcome. And maybe that's what breaks me the most, the way he's already learned to expect so little. I don't want to be another name on the long list of people who've let him down. But wanting something and being ready for it are two very different things. I think about the practicalities, about the way my budget will stretch thinner than it already is, about the exhaustion that will inevitably settle into my bones as I adjust to taking care of two boys instead of one, about the small, simple moments of my life that will change in ways I can't yet fully predict. I wonder if Ethan will ever resent me for it, if he will feel like he has to share too much. His home, his father, the little world we've built together. I think about all of it, and still my heart keeps circling back to the same place. Because I know deep down that the hardest things in life are often the ones most worth doing. And so as I watch Lucas and Ethan sitting on the living room floor, hunched over a board game, their laughter echoing through the small space that already feels too much like home to be anything else, I know my decision has already been made, even if I haven't said it out loud yet. The decision, once it settled into place, was not the sudden, triumphant kind that people imagine when they picture life-altering choices. There was no grand moment of realization, no surge of confidence or certainty. Instead, it felt more like a slow tide, creeping in quietly, shaping the shore little by little until one day I looked around and realized I had already been standing in the water for a long time. It wasn't about weighing pros and cons anymore. It wasn't even about fear or doubt. It was about something far simpler, something more inevitable. Lucas needed a place to belong, and somehow, over time, my home had already become that place for him. I could tell myself I was still deciding, that I was still thinking it over, but the truth was, in all the ways that mattered, I had already chosen him. And yet knowing it and saying it out loud were two very different things. I found myself rehearsing it in my head in the quiet moments, the walk to the car in the morning, the stillness of the house after the boys had gone to bed, the pause between washing one dish and picking up the next. I kept trying to find the right words, to frame it in a way that made sense, as if saying it properly would somehow make it feel more manageable. But life has a way of pulling decisions out of you before you're ready to voice them. It happened on a Tuesday, just a regular evening where nothing felt particularly significant. The house smelled like leftover pasta, the heater hummed quietly against the chill of December air, and the boys were sprawled across the couch, engaged in one of their usual debates over which superhero could beat the other in a fight. I had been standing at the kitchen sink, hands submerged in warm, soapy water, staring out the window at the empty street beyond, when Lucas's voice broke through the moment. It was casual, almost too casual, the way he asked if he should start looking into what the foster homes in other counties were like. There was no bitterness in it, no anger, just a quiet resignation, the kind that suggested he had already accepted whatever was coming next. And in that instant, something inside me hardened, something final and immovable. I turned, drying my hands on a dish towel, and told him that he wasn't going anywhere. The words came out simpler than I had expected, but they carried more weight than anything I had said in a long time. I told him that I had already spoken to the social worker, that I was filing the paperwork, that this house, the one where he had spent so many nights, where his laughter had already found its place between the walls, was his home now, if he wanted it to be. I watched as he processed it, the way his shoulders tensed, the way his fingers curled slightly against his knees. He didn't say anything right away, didn't leap up with excitement or burst into tears the way a scene like this might play out in a movie. Instead, he just sat there, staring at the floor, blinking a little too quickly, as if he wasn't sure whether to believe it. And then, in the quietest voice I had ever heard from him, he asked if I was sure. That question hit me harder than I expected, because I could see what he really meant buried beneath the simple words. He wasn't just asking if I had made my decision, he was asking if I would change my mind later, if one day I would look at him and realize that the weight of this choice was more than I could bear. I crossed the room, sat down across from him, and told him the truth. I told him that I had never been more sure of anything in my life. And as the silence stretched between us, as his eyes flickered with something raw and uncertain, as Ethan, still half absorbed in their earlier conversation, playfully shoved him in the shoulder as if nothing had changed, I saw the moment it finally settled in. Lucas wasn't just staying here. He belonged here. And somehow, despite all my worries, all my fears of whether I was enough, whether I could give him what he needed, I realized something I hadn't fully grasped before. Maybe this wasn't just about what I could give him. Maybe this was about what we could give each other. Update. The months that followed were filled with more adjustments than I had anticipated, not just in the logistics of our daily lives, but in the quiet, unspoken ways that a home reshapes itself when another person truly becomes part of it. I had spent so much time worrying about whether I could handle it, whether I had the resources, the patience, the strength. But the reality of it wasn't as dramatic as my fears had made it seem. It wasn't about grand sacrifices or sudden, overwhelming burdens. It was about the small things, the everyday moments that over time wove themselves into something deeper, something unshakable. At first, Lucas treaded carefully, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop, as if he was bracing himself for the moment I might wake up and decide I had made a mistake. He continued his habit of keeping his things neat and contained, never leaving his clothes scattered, never asking for anything he didn't absolutely need. He still hesitated before grabbing food from the fridge, still checked in too often to make sure he wasn't imposing. It was subtle, but I could see it. The way he still carried the weight of years spent believing he was someone else's burden to bear. I didn't push him. Instead, I let time do the work. Slowly, he began to settle, to stretch out into the space I had given him, as if testing the limits of whether it would really hold. At first, it was small things: a forgotten sock on the floor, a second helping of dinner without asking, an offhanded complaint about homework that suggested he no longer felt like he had to be grateful for everything just to keep his place here. Then one night, I caught him arguing with Ethan over the remote, laughing as they swatted at each other like any pair of brothers would. It was such a simple thing, so ordinary, but it struck me all the same. He wasn't just staying here anymore. He was home, but not everything was easy. There were nights when he still woke up restless, footsteps barely audible as he paced the hallway before finally settling back into bed. There were days when he withdrew, when the walls he had spent years building around himself felt too thick to break through. And there were moments, fewer and farther between, but still there, when I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the question that still lurked beneath the surface. What if this doesn't last? I had to remind myself that trust, real trust, isn't built overnight. And so I did what I always did. I showed up. I was there in the mornings, making breakfast, making sure he had what he needed for school, making sure he knew he didn't have to ask for the basics of care and comfort. I was there in the evenings, reminding him that this was his home, too, that he could take up space, that he didn't have to earn his right to be here. And I was there in the quiet moments, when he wasn't ready to talk but needed someone to sit with him anyway, someone to remind him that he didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. Ethan, for his part, never once made Lucas feel like an outsider. I had worried at first about how the shift might affect him, about whether he would start to feel like he had lost something in the process of gaining a brother. But if he did, he never showed it. To him, Lucas wasn't a burden, or a guest, or an obligation. He was simply part of the equation now, another voice in the house, another presence at the dinner table, another piece of the life we were building together. And then, just when I thought we had finally found our rhythm, something happened that reminded me just how fragile all of this still was. It was a cold afternoon in February when I got a call from the school, the kind of call that makes your heart drop into your stomach before you even process the words being spoken. Lucas had gotten into a fight, his first real fight since coming to live with us, and they needed me to come down right away. When I arrived, I found him sitting outside the principal's office, his jaw clenched tight, his hands curled into fists in his lap. There was a bruise forming on his cheek, a small cut on his knuckles, but he barely seemed to notice. I didn't ask what had happened, not yet. Instead, I sat down next to him, waited for him to speak first. Minutes passed before he finally exhaled, slow and unsteady, and muttered that some kid had been running his mouth about how he was just a charity case, how no one really wanted him, how he'd end up just like his mother no matter how hard he tried to pretend otherwise. I felt something tighten in my chest, an anger I hadn't expected, not just at the cruelty of the words, but at the fact that Lucas had clearly believed them, even if only for a second. Later, after the meeting with the principal, after the suspension had been handed down, after the drive home filled with tense silence, I sat him down and told him the only thing that mattered. I told him that nothing anyone else said about him would ever change what was real, that he wasn't here because I had been forced into it, that he wasn't here because I felt sorry for him. I told him that he was part of this family, that he belonged here, that no one, not some kid at school, not his past, not even his own fears, could take that away from him. I told him that he wasn't alone, not anymore, not ever again. He didn't say anything, not at first. But later that night, as I passed his room on my way to bed, I heard it. His voice, quiet but steady, telling Ethan that he was glad he hadn't been sent somewhere else. Telling him that, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had something worth fighting for. And as I stood there listening, I realized something I hadn't been able to put into words before. This wasn't just about saving Lucas. This was about building something stronger than the past, about proving that love, real, unconditional love, isn't about obligation or pity or doing what's easy. It's about showing up over and over again until the people who need it most finally believe it's real. And as I turned off the hallway light, as I let the quiet of the house settle around me, I knew, without a doubt, that I would keep showing up for as long as it took, because that's what family does.